Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide, which will take place next week from April 3rd to 7th. This conference, this two-day conference, along with the symposium next week, are part of a commitment by Vanier College to raise awareness of the Holocaust and genocide. Each year, for more than 2 decades, symposium organizers have been planning a comprehensive calendar of activities involving guest speakers, lectures, films, survivor testimony, and student participation. As part of the 25th edition of this important event, it was decided to also hold this two-day conference, which will feature numerous guest speakers and panel discussions. Some of the speakers for this incredible conference include Vanier graduate Dr. Charles Small, founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, Montreal Mayor Denis Coderre, and UN High-Level Commissioner Dr. Ali Murabit. As well, Paul Korwatsky of CTV News Montreal will be moderating a panel discussion on the topic of pursuing justice for political prisoners. What's also new this year is the fact that remote links will be created throughout the conference and symposium that will subsequently be webcast from Montreal to classrooms at the State University of New York in Plattsburgh, as well as to high schools in Plattsburgh. This is being made possible thanks to the collaboration of Mountain Lake PBS and Learn Quebec. So we thank them for that. As well, thanks to live streaming, individuals from around the world will be able to watch the different speakers. This initiative offers concrete proof of the advantages that technology can offer by eliminating geographical distances for the benefit of education. I'd also like to take this opportunity to announce how proud Vanier College is that Professor Erwin Kotler accepted to be honorary chairman of Vanier's 25th Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide. Mr. Kotler was a member of Parliament for over 15 years and served as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. We'd like to thank Mr. Kotler for his involvement in this event, and Mr. Kotler will be arriving shortly. It's on a very, very busy schedule, but he will be arriving shortly to participate. It is truly amazing to see how the symposium has evolved over the years from its modest beginnings. It actually began as an event organized by former Vanier humanities teacher Dr. Neil Kaplan and Naomi Kramer, director of the current Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation, and who is with us here this morning. Today, more than 2 decades later, the mission of the symposium remains the same in terms of sensitizing students and the general population to the moral responsibility that all of us have towards one another. It is extremely fitting that an event like the Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide has been taking place at Vanier College. Vanier is proud to be one of the most culturally diverse educational institutions in North America, with students from over 90 nationalities. The symposium, which has been attended by thousands of people over the years, offers a unique opportunity to sensitize Vanier students and staff, as well as members of the larger community, to the horrors of the past, while also focusing on genocide, discrimination, and prejudice taking place in the present. In keeping with this educational mission, in May, more than 30 students from Vanier and the State University of New York at Plattsburgh will be traveling to Europe as part of the program entitled, or part of a program entitled, Moral Responsibility and Global Citizenship. Vanier is proud to have been able to raise awareness of these issues, and we are entirely committed to continuing the journey of Holocaust education. I would like to take this opportunity to wish everyone an excellent two-day conference. Before we get to our first speaker, it is my honor to launch this conference with a few words by our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau unfortunately could not be with us here today at Vanier College. However, he was kind enough to record a video message in which he speaks about the importance of continuing to speak out against racism and hate.
Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à la conférence sur la justice et la responsabilisation du Collège Vanier. C'est très touchant de savoir que vous êtes tous rassemblés ici. Au cours des 2 prochains jours, vous confronterez l'un des moments les plus sombres de notre histoire et le silence qui a mené à une tragédie inconcevable. Il y a 78 ans, le Canada a demandé au Saint-Louis de faire demi-tour et est resté indifférent face aux réfugiés juifs. La politique d'immigration, qui était caractérisée par la phrase « aucun, c'est encore trop », constitue l'un des chapitres les plus sombres de notre histoire et nous ne devons jamais l'oublier. As your generation looks back upon our imperfections and our failings, it's up to you to ensure we uphold our sacred promises and bring meaning to the solemn vow, never again. These are not just words, they're a call to action, a call to always speak out against racism and hate, and to stand on guard against a resurgence of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, prejudice, and intolerance. Silence is not an option because progress is never permanent. Every generation must answer the call and renew the values that we hold dear and cherish. So thank you for being here today and for answering that call. Bon congrès. Merci.
Thank you to the Prime Minister for that message. This 2-day conference will feature an extremely impressive lineup of policymakers, diplomats, and academics who will be stimulating dialogue on the extremely important issues of justice and accountability. Today, more than ever, these issues are extremely relevant given the global context that we currently find ourselves in. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce our conference's first speaker. All the more so since he is a proud graduate of Vanier College. And we always look forward to welcoming back our graduates. Dr. Charles Small is the founding director and president of the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. Dr. Small convened groundbreaking academic seminar series in the emerging field of contemporary anti-Semitism studies at Columbia University, Fordham University, Harvard University, McGill University, and the Sorbonne. Dr. Small is also the founding director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, the first interdisciplinary research center on anti-Semitism at a North American university. He has lectured internationally and worked as a consultant and policy advisor in North America, Europe, South Africa, and the Middle East. Dr. Small specializes in social and cultural theory, globalization and national identity, social cultural policy, social movements, and racism, including anti-Semitism. Dr. Small is also the author of many books and articles, including the 6-volume Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity. Dr. Small is also committed to creating scholarly programming and research on contemporary anti-Semitism at top-tier universities internationally and establishing contemporary anti-Semitism studies as a recognized academic discipline. Born in Montreal, he has a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University and has taught at the University of London, Ben Gurion University, Tel Aviv University, and Hebrew University. In September 2006, Yale University founded the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, the first North American university-based center for the study of the subject, housed in the Institute for Social and Policy Studies. He cited the increase in anti-Semitism worldwide in recent years as generating a need to understand the current manifestation of this disease. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Charles Small.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's a real privilege to be here and to open this very important conference. It's the 25th anniversary of the conference, and it's especially nice to come home to Montreal for this event, as serious an issue as it is. And the subject of genocide, unfortunately, is a large subject, and unfortunately, it's a contemporary subject. We should have these conferences one day as soon as possible in history departments, not in sort of interdisciplinary studies of genocide. This subject needs to get into the history department, and this type of human barbarism somehow needs to stop. So I think being here in Canada, I would like to start off by, I think we should take note as Canadians, and I think Canada has taken steps to take note. But we have to remember that in our history, in the establishment of Canada, in the establishment of the Americas by European settlers, that there is a history of genocide here. There's a history of genocide in what is now called Quebec, and there's a history of genocide, what is now called Canada. And the Indigenous people, the First Nations people, still have significant cultural, socioeconomic, political problems and issues that we need to address. And I think, as Prime Minister Trudeau eloquently said, never to forget is a call to action. So steps have certainly been made in this country. Improvements have occurred, but we still have to listen to the original people of this land and to try our very best to rectify the severe issues, health issues, psychological issues, economic issues, abject poverty, suicide rates that still plague our society. And I think as Canadians focusing on a two-day very important issue of genocide and the legacies of genocide, that we need to really take this into consideration and reflect upon it. And I see students here, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So, genocide. So as we speak, and as we hold this conference, there is a genocide taking place today on the internet, in real time, easily accessible to watch and to monitor. And I'm talking about this horrific genocide taking place in Syria. More than 500,000 people murdered, estimates of 12 to 15 million refugees flooding into neighboring countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and moving into Europe. And this genocide causing great instability in the Middle East and in the region and beyond, even into Europe. And there's some commentators that show how the crisis, the genocide in Syria is now even shaking the foundations of European unity, of the European Union, and Brexit, I think, is a result, if you will, from the migration and the refugee crisis now affecting Europe. And we're living in a time where these issues have been by and large ignored by our leaders. And this horrible situation in Syria certainly could have been avoided. And it could have been avoided for many years and for a long time, but for various interests, which I'll touch on in my talk, we have acquiesced to the ideology that openly calls for the annihilation of people who are different. Canada has, I think, a very special place in developing and learning from its history of our treatment of the First Nations. Canadian scholars like Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka have been at the forefront, and Canada has been at the forefront of introducing the notion of multiculturalism, of recognizing the other as the cornerstone of not only a democratic society, but a humane society. And I think of the words of Professor Emmanuel Levinas. Professor Emmanuel Levinas was perhaps one of the most important, or is one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. He was born in Lithuania as a young scholar. About 17 years old, he went to France to study. A young Jewish boy, 17 years old, going to France. And by going to France, he escaped the Holocaust in his home of Lithuania, his home country of Lithuania. In Lithuania, they had the highest kill rate in the Holocaust. Over 95% of the Jews were exterminated in Lithuania. Emmanuel Levinas survived. His entire family was murdered and annihilated during the Holocaust. And he went on, in a way, to bring Jewish ethics, Jewish thought, the wisdom of Judaism to Western thought, to the Western canon. And you have to remember that Europe was segregationist for all sorts of reasons, and the thought of the other was never really taught at universities for long periods of time. So Levinas was at the cutting edge of bringing Jewish wisdom and ethics to the philosophy of Europe. And Emmanuel Levinas, quoting the Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avot it's called, the part of the Talmud that teaches ethics. And he said famously, and his philosophy was intrinsically based on this, that the moment we see our face in the face of the other, the moment we see our face in the face of the other is the instant we become human. So the moment you see your face in the face of the other is the instant you become human. And this is what Jewish ethics, for example, is based on. So, and it's through this recognition that societies create humane conditions for its citizens, recognizing the other. And in Jewish thought, for example, it's believed that if we're all created in the image of God, we have a truth. The only way to wisdom is to understand other people's truths. So if I am sexist, for example, I've eliminated 300 or 3 billion and a half possibilities for me to be wise. If I'm racist against people of African origin, I've cheated myself on over 1 billion possibilities to become wiser. So the arrogance, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the sexism, the homophobia, rejecting the other, limits ourselves. It hurts ourselves ethically, morally, and of course, it harms our society. Emmanuel Levinas also went on to say that ideologies and thought that does not recognize the other, thought, ideologies that perpetuate notions of supremacy, of inferiority, ideologies that justify subjugation and segregation, that justify war, that justify, and I'm choosing my words carefully, genocide. Those ideologies, Emmanuel Levinas, the person who taught the ethics, the foundation that influenced Taylor and Kimlicka and Canadian multiculturalism philosophically, the founder of this recognizing of the other also vehemently taught, strongly believed that the ideologies that justify apartheid, the ideologies that justify genocide, the ideologies that stereotype and subjugate and call for harming groups, that we should never tolerate them. We should never tolerate the intolerable. So when ideologies call for genocide, we cannot acquiesce. And we're living in a time, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll get to it in a moment, where we have acquiesced. Our universities, our media of record, our public intellectuals, our policymakers have acquiesced. And those of us who have studied anti-Semitism, and I should put as a footnote, the organization that I work for, the research center that I work for, and Erwin Kotler has been involved with, and we had the amazing privilege and honor for Elie Wiesel to be our president until his passing about a year ago, less than a year ago. The Nobel Peace Prize winner, Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, who wrote a very important book called Night for the students in the room. If you haven't read the book Night, it's a very thin book of about 100-odd pages. You can read it in 2 hours, and I promise that it will change your life. That Elie Wiesel, who was the president of ISGAP, also spoke about not taking responsibility. He spoke in 2003 and stated that we're living in a time of great urgency. And then he went on to correct himself, and he said, we're not living in times of great urgency, we're living in a time of a great emergency. In 2003, Elie Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust, who spent his whole life fighting for human rights, for Jewish rights, for the rights of Israel, for the people of South Africa, for the people of Bosnia, Cambodia, was terrified at the rise of anti-Semitism, the demonization of Jewish people just decades after the Holocaust. And he was saying in 2003 that this was a great emergency. And the Syrian genocide is connected to our acquiescence. Today at universities throughout the Western world, there are no courses on contemporary anti-Semitism. There are courses on the history of the Holocaust, on the history of anti-Semitism, but nothing on contemporary anti-Semitism. And this, for students in the room, is an acquiescence to danger. And not only aren't there serious courses on contemporary anti-Semitism, we know, those of us who've experienced, our families and ancestors have experienced anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism is often perceived as a Jewish problem, as a problem for Israel. It's a parochial issue. It's a special interest issue. It's not an issue for society. But those of us who study anti-Semitism know that this type of hatred, once it's unleashed upon society, it may begin with Jews, but it never ever ends with Jews. And famously, Frantz Fanon, do people know who Frantz Fanon was? Pardon? A writer, philosopher, thinker, somebody concerned about the emancipation of Africa. In France, when he was a student, he used to tell his African comrades, when you meet Europeans and they attack the Jews, remember that when you leave the room, they're going to attack you. People who hate, hate. And anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ever ends with Jews. Once this hatred is unleashed on society, its destruction knows no barriers. And I would submit to you that it's because of acquiescing to contemporary anti-Semitism that we have massive problems in this world today. Massive. Martin Luther King famously said, he tells the story of Rip Van Winkle, the man who slept through the revolution. He went to sleep, slept through the American Revolution, and he woke up when George Washington was the president, and the British had gone. And Martin Luther King used to preach about how elite universities, the media of record, were promoting and maintaining segregation. Churches were maintaining segregation. But that at sports events and at nightclubs and social clubs, young African American and white American students were mixing and exchanging and developing and being creative, while the old guard was sleeping through the revolution that was happening in American cities and throughout the society. And I submit to you that we've been sleeping through a revolution. And this revolution is a reactionary revolution. It's a homophobic, sexist revolution. It's a revolution that does not accept the other, as democratic and humane societies do. It's a revolution that wants to destroy any semblance of democratic principles, any notion that we ought to be equal under one legal system in a democracy. And I'm speaking about political Islam. Now, political Islam is not Islam. Political Islam is not Muslims. Political Islam is a reactionary social movement that began 100 years ago in Egypt. It's a political ideology. It's an ideology that has twisted or broken away from Islam to create its own social movement. Some on the extreme right demonize all Muslims and Islam because of this reactionary social movement, and some who claim to be on the left ignore it and not allow free discussion of it because we don't want to be Islamophobic, the new term that was developed and aided and abetted to be disseminated by the Iranian revolutionary regime, the concept of Islamophobia. That's not to say there's discrimination against Muslims in Canada or in other societies. There is. But the notion of Islamophobia is a concept that comes out of Iran 20 years ago. So as scholars, we need to understand the words that we use. So I'm going to give you the history of anti-Semitism very briefly and how it ties into what we confront today. So there's three phases of anti-Semitism, and I would call it anti-Semitisms. And anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms, unlike other forms of hatred, is inherently genocidal. Unlike other forms of hatred, no matter how horrific and repugnant and damaging and destructive they are, anti-Semitism is unique in that it's inherently genocidal. So as a scholar, I make and my colleagues make this differentiation. So why is it so? The first phase of anti-Semitism was when the church was dominant in Europe. The church taught, I'm giving you the history of anti-Semitism in a few moments, but essentially the church taught that the Jews were blinded by the devil, blinded by evil, because they wouldn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. And if you didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, you would not have redemption. So the Jews were blinded. But what makes anti-Semitism genocidal is that people were also teaching at the time from the church that not only was the individual Jew unable to have redemption, but that the Jews, by not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah, were hindering the redemption of the world. So until the Jew changed, the world would not be redeemed. So you could imagine the forced conversions, the exiles, the pogroms, the violence against this stubborn group of people who, by and large, refused to accept the prevailing view at the time. So this is where anti-Semitism is genocidal. When the dominant phase or the dominant way of perceiving reality shifted from religion to race and to science and to ethnicity and to biology, Jews who lived in societies in the Middle East and in Europe for centuries were suddenly the wrong race, because we know racism is a socially constructed idea, that race is an idea that was created by European thinkers, scientists, philosophers, theologians. So the Jew was the race that was now close to the white Aryan pure race, the pure nation, and that this impure race was going to poison the purity of the white Aryan race. So this race, this impure race, had to be removed to save the purity of the white race. And unlike during the times of Christianity, where there was an escape hatch, the Jew could have converted to be saved, just literally save his life or her life. In this case, this type of racist anti-Semitism began pogroms, violent attacks against Jews, slaughtering of Jews throughout Europe in the 18th and 19th century, and leads to the Shoah. It leads to the Holocaust, in which 6 million or more Jews were annihilated. Some ran for survival, some survived, but the final solution, if you will, was a cause the raison d'etre behind it was to save the purity of the white race from this impure race. Now, today, in 2017, I'm sure in Vanier College and in other educational institutions, in the media record, if people would espouse the old Christian anti-Semitic ideologies or the old racist, biologically determined racist anti-Semitism, that they would be pretty much ostracized from their networks, ostracized from society. It wouldn't be acceptable in most spaces. But today, the new anti-Semitism, the most dominant form of the anti-Semitism, the contemporary one, is an attack on who Jews are as a people. It's an attack on Jewish peoplehood. And namely, for the past 2 generations, the demonization of the connection and the association and the fundamental core element that Jewish people have in their religion and culture is the connection to their homeland in Israel and in Zion. And the demonization of Israel, the dehumanization of Israel, the delegitimization of Israel is not only prevalent in our society, it's celebrated in our society. If you want a good academic job, if you want a good job in journalism, if you want to succeed socially, demonize Israel. The only democracy in the region, you demonize it. The only society in the Middle East in which minorities have rights in law, in which women are equal under the law, in which gay people have rights and are equal under the law, where Muslims are equal under the law, where there's a free press, where there's a vibrant university system, where there's a society of migration and integration and of art and of music that surpasses perhaps, I don't know of another society at this moment in time that's being so creative. High-tech advancements, medical advancements, scientific breakthroughs in this vibrant space, and yet, Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is a racist state. Israel is a colonial state. Israel is a state that pinkwashes. It promotes the rights of gay people just to trick Western society. And it's this type of attack on who Jews are as a people that is dominant in society. And just like in World War II, when the Nazis were focusing on the Jewish banker and the Jewish poor people and the Jews living in the shtetl, the ghetto, and the Jews that were poisoning the purity of the race, and the Jews that were trying to control society, while everybody was instructed to focus over here, the Nazis and the reactionary social movements began to take power over here and to begin to march on society, to take over industry, to advance its goals on various society, and to launch the Second World War. And many in the West, in Canada, Irving Abella's book, None is Too Many, is a classic. The United States, where the industrialists wanted to work with the Nazis under the excuse that they were anti-communists and that this was just a Jewish problem. But we saw, yes, there was a Holocaust. Yes, 6 million Jews died. But as the Nazis were marching on Europe, more than 80 million Europeans died once this hate was ignored for short-term gain. Europe was essentially destroyed, its infrastructure devastated, mass murders, morally, ethically, politically bankrupted. But the focus was on the Jew, and nobody was paying attention to over here. And the same thing is underway today. And thanks to our miseducation, we have developed policies that are essentially doing something similar. Focus on the apartheid racist South Africa demonized Israel. And over here, we have a reactionary social movement that is at war not just with the Jews, but it's at war with its own people. And I'm speaking about the Muslim Brotherhood. Has anybody in this room, students, scholars, have studied the Muslim Brotherhood? So this is my experience too. You're not alone. I went to good universities. I went to Vanier, great university, great college. I went to McGill. I then went on to the University of London and then to Oxford. And I taught at the University of London, and then I went to live in Jerusalem. And I was involved, I come from a human rights background, by the way. I was involved in the First Nations issue here. I was involved with issues of police brutality in Montreal in the 1980s and 90s. I was involved in trying to help Soviet and Ethiopian Jews in the 80s and 90s. And I was also the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada and the United Kingdom. And I worked with the leadership of the ANC. So I come from this sort of social democratic Canadian, quintessential Canadian human rights background. And when I was in Jerusalem, I met and I was part of a group of scholars, Israeli Jewish scholars and Palestinian scholars. And we were trying to understand each other and to try to further peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And we would meet every 2 weeks at somebody's house, and I would meet this professor, a very nice guy, a wonderful man, very cultured, very warm. And you know, when you study philosophy and politics, you get to understand pretty quickly if somebody is religious or secular, if they're right-wing, if they're left-wing, if they're racist or anti-Semitic or they're not. You kind of get a sense of people. And this guy was saying things we would argue strongly, and I had no idea where he was coming from. I couldn't figure him out. He was saying the most, but to me, to my ears, the most bizarre things about democracy, about civil rights, about Martin Luther King, about women, about Jews. It was astounding. And yet he was a nice, educated man. So after our fourth argument, I said, you know what? Can you recommend some books for me to read? Because I don't understand where you're coming from. I don't get you. We're just fighting. We're just arguing. So he was very, very kind, cultured man. He said, sure. And he gave me a list of books. And he gave me the list of people like Qutb and al-Banai, the founding fathers, the founding intellectuals of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I urge you to read it, because this ideology of political Islam is what we're confronting today in Montreal, in Europe, and certainly in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and beyond. And this ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood was a reaction to British colonialism, and it took at its core, not the extreme, not the military wing, not the extreme element of the Muslim Brotherhood, but at its core, it took, and I'm choosing my words carefully, it took Nazi ideology and fused it with Islam. It took the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Do people know what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a book that claimed to be sitting on this secret meeting where Jews were conspiring to take over the world. It's called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a lie. It's a fraud. But this book, this text, circulated throughout Europe. It came out of Russia or France, depending on your view of things. And it had all these conspiracy theories about Jewish people. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this lie, played a key role in removing Jews from society, in subjugating them and segregating them, putting them into ghettos, putting them to forced labor camps, and eventually justifying the Holocaust. Now this book, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is at the core of political Islam. It's at the core, it's the central element of the nation, of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you should read, if you read the Hamas charter on the internet, Hamas is an offshoot of the Brotherhood. Islamic Jihad, Wahhabism, all comes from this ideology that began in Egypt about 100 years ago as a reaction to British colonialism. Even the Iranian revolutionary regime, Iran, which is a Shiite country, often at odds with the Sunni world, which is Egyptian and Saudi, even the Iranian revolutionary regime pays homage and thanks intellectually the work of the Muslim Brotherhood and the intellectuals as the impetus for their revolution. And they're honored heroes in Iran. Now, what we have to do as scholars is, don't take my word for it. Read the Hamas Charter. Read the intellectuals from the Muslim Brotherhood and see their perception of democracy, their Nazi perception of Jews as causing all the problems in the world, financial, even health, all the problems coming out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So you have this Nazi-like reactionary social movement that literally calls for the killing of Jews. It calls for the destruction, not just for the destruction of Israel, but the killing of all Jewish people. It calls for the killing of gay people. It calls for the subjugation of women. It calls for the subjugation and the second-class status of religious minorities. And it goes on and on. And they are opposed to democracy because democracy is nothing more than a Western Christian imposition on Arab countries. So this is the ideology of a reactionary social movement that is diametrically opposed to everything we believe in. And I say we, you could be on the extreme left in Canada or on the extreme right. You can be of any ideological position, but if you believe that we have the right to be equal under one legal system, regardless of our religion, our language, our race, our ethnicity, our social class, that this cornerstone of democracy, of citizenship, if you believe in that, this is a movement that we have to be aware of and confront. In the academy, the social sciences for the last 2 generations have been certainly, I would say, dominated or certainly influenced by postmodernity. After the Holocaust, after the excesses of the Second World War, intellectuals wanted to move away from binary notions of identity. Postmodernity doesn't believe in good and evil. It's a relativist philosophy. All narratives should be heard and understood and are equal to each other. So good and evil is out the window. People like Michel Foucault and Edward Said, who pushes Orientalism, who push this narrative of Palestinian nationalism, which is at now very much influenced in the social sciences of Western universities. That this type of ideology or this type of teaching has not enabled us to look critically at reactionary movements in spaces that were once colonized. Now, it's my understanding that we're obligated to look at reactionary social movements wherever they are. And turning a blind eye or pretending to be liberal or pretending not to want to intervene in which people are being enslaved or slaughtered is problematic, despite the history of colonialism, despite the history of racism, despite the history of anti-Semitism, that we have to have gotten away from this legacy as much as we can. But when the political Islamists are killing people in Syria and committing a genocide, when wanted violence is becoming a daily routine in northern Nigeria, when Libya is in chaos, Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, when this reactionary social movement, which is diametrically opposed to Western democratic values, to humanity, of recognizing the other, when we turn a blind eye to it, I would submit to you, it's not only unethical, but it's dangerous for all. One of the issues that I was very active in was the Iranian issue. I see Professor Kotler coming here. Welcome, and Professor Kotler certainly was as well. That's not Professor Kotler. The Iranian regime, which takes the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Iranian regime that takes this political Islamist ideology as its constitution, These are constitutions that, like Hamas, calls for the killing of Jews in black and white. This is not, again, the ranting and ravings of the extremists or the military wing. This is the Constitution. This is the raison d'etre. We have constitutions now of these organizations and parties that literally, in black and white, call for the killing of Jews. And of course, the Iranian revolutionary regime is obligated, and I'm choosing my words carefully, it's obligated to destroy Israel. Why? Because in political Islam, you cannot have democracy. In political Islam, when I say democracy, you can have citizenship, because it's not permitted for a Jew to be equal to a Muslim. And if you look at the history of discrimination of Jews in Muslim countries, and we have to remember that the largest amount of Jewish Israelis today are descendants from Muslim countries. They came from Iran, they came from Iraq, they came from Syria, they came from Egypt to Israel, often under very distressed situations. There are more Jewish refugees that came to Israel than the refugees that were Palestinian, or Palestinians who were made into refugees. But this is a narrative that is little heard or understood. So here's a regime that calls for the annihilating of Israel because Jews in Israel who have self-determination insist on equality under the law, that all citizens will be equal regardless of religious background. So the thing is, no matter how big Israel is, if Israel gave up, and it has given up Gaza, if it gives up the West Bank, if it cedes all of its territory except for Tel Aviv and makes a city-state, Tel Aviv, according to the Muslim Brotherhood, to Hamas, to Islamic Jihad, to the Iranian revolutionary regime, would not be permitted. And it would not be permitted because in this little city-state of Tel Aviv, if it's a democracy, the Jews will be equal to the Muslims under the land, under the law of the land. But you cannot have a Jew equal to a Muslim, they have to be beneath. So from a political Islamist perspective, there is no recognition of the other. It's impossible to recognize the self-determination of Israel or Jews in any space in the region from that worldview, from that perspective. So this is not an issue of territory or boundaries. This is an issue that is sort of a religious political ideology at war with Israel, the little Satan, and the West, the big Satan. But what happened recently with the P5+1 and the agreement with Iran of the nuclear weapons industry, or weapons program, was for this deal that we're not sure exists or not, that Iran will be brought back into the family of nations. Assets will be unfrozen. Major deals with Western corporations will be made. Siemens, Boeing, the list goes on. And between unfrozen assets and new business deals, some estimate that this agreement was worth to Iran approximately $150 billion. That's more than 50 years of aid that Israel receives from the United States, its biggest recipient. 50 years of aid in one agreement. And of course, no ideological demands on Iran, and they're brought back into the family of nations. And I'll submit to you that this short-term gain for the West, for the Obama administration, for the other 5 countries that dealt with this agreement, that this funds that have been injected into the Persian, or to the Iranian rather, economy has had an impact, has had an effect on genocide. The killing in Syria has accelerated. The creation of more refugees has accelerated. And we in the West, again, we in the West have turned a blind eye to the humanitarian crisis, to the crises that are affecting the people, and for 2 pieces of silver engaged in an agreement with a regime that calls for the extermination of the Jews, and like in the past when everybody made it into a Jewish issue or into an Israeli issue, right? Remember the rhetoric coming out for people who supported this agreement was, it was the Jews and the Israelis, it was the Likud party, the extreme right of the Zionist movement that was trying to squash this deal of peace. And that peace was going to break out, but it was the Zionists controlled by Sheldon Adelson, the banker, and Netanyahu and the Likud that was damaging this agreement, and that the world wanted peace. But look at what's happened. The regime that dehumanizes Jews, that uses Nazi ideology, and I'm choosing my words deliberately as a scholar, that uses Nazi ideology by focusing on the Jew among nations, over here is exterminating their own fellow Muslim people. And the crisis accelerates, because now when you have millions of refugees who come out of this horrific theater of war, who come from societies and villages that have a deep history and a deep culture and are rooted there in their homes for many, many generations. When their homes are destroyed, when thousands of their family members are killed, when they're driven out of their home, when they're put into tents and made to live in subhuman conditions, and they're not happy people. And this also is fertile ground for the people who've caused this problem in the first place to prey on these displaced, frightened, marginalized people, and to give them easy solutions to just refuel this movement that is reactionary and anti-humane. And this is a catastrophe. And I think those of us who claim to be liberals, and those of us who claim to be in the human rights community, and those of us who claim to be feminists, and those of us who claim to care about gendered inequality and equality for all, we have no business acquiescing. We have no business acquiescing to an ideology, to a social movement, to a reactionary social movement that is using Nazi propaganda, because we know, my parents knew, my grandparents know, that when you acquiesce to this type of ideology and when you acquiesce to anti-Semitism, it begins with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews, ever. So the question is, how will this genie that's now out of the bottle be stopped? And it's coming here. There's mosques in Montreal where some brave journalists have been recording spiritual leaders saying the most disgusting things about human beings, in this case, Jewish people. In France, I just came back from Belgium, from Brussels. There are good, decent Muslim citizens of Europe who are being tarnished by this brush because we have acquiesced to the anti-Semitism. I work with Muslim scholars from Pakistan, from Morocco, from India, from Egypt, and they are aware of the dangers of anti-Semitism because they see it destroying their families, their mosques, their communities, their countries. And they are more strident in their fight against anti-Semitism than many of my Jewish brothers and sisters, and certainly many of my liberal, and I'm putting this in quotations, comrades from the human rights and the anti-apartheid movement that I grew up in this country. And we have acquiesced. And I'll end with one story. I'll show you how deep this penetrates into our academic system, and then I'm going to share a story about Rwanda. So this, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce to you in this video of the founding head of the Board of Trustees of the finest university in the Western world, the founder of Islamic Studies at Oxford University. The founder of Islamic Studies at Oxford University. This institution that was funded by the Muslim Brotherhood out of Qatar, funded not just Oxford, we're talking about, and we're doing research in our center, about many, many billions of dollars funneling into the best universities in the United Kingdom, throughout Europe, in Canada, and in the United States. Again, for short-term gain, we take money and we don't ask questions. So here is Sheikh Kawadari, Yosef Kawadari, who is the spiritual father of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's the most important thinker in the Muslim Brotherhood. The grandson of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Tariq Ramadan. Has anybody heard of Tariq Ramadan, by the way? A very important philosopher, a few people have heard. Very smooth, very intelligent, multilingual, good-looking, a philosopher, a thinker, who is pushing Muslim Brotherhood light in the universities. The first thing that President Obama did before he even became president was to lift an embargo on Tariq Ramadan, who was banned from the United States because of his anti-Semitism. He got a visa. The first thing he did, got a visa to enter the United States and went to Notre Dame University. So here's Sheikh Kawadari, the most important spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the head of the Oxford Board of Trustees of Islamic Studies.
سلط عليهم طوال التاريخ من يؤدبهم نتيجة إفسادهم. آخر تأديب كان تأديب هتلر، ما فعل بهم وإن كانوا بالغوا في الأمر ما بلغوا، ولكن استطاع أن يعني يوقفهم عند حدودهم، وكان هذا أدبا إلهيا، تأديبا إلهيا، عقابا قدريا لهؤلاء. والمرة القادمة إن شاء الله ستكون على أيدي المؤمنين. كل ما أتمناه في ختام كلمتي هذا أن يهيئ الله لي في ختام حياتي فرصة للذهاب إلى أرض الجهاد والمقاومة على كرسي متحرك، فأطلق رصاصة على أعداء الله اليهود ويطلقون علي قنبلة أختم بها حياتي بالشهادة وأقول الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
So in other words, it's the believer's obligation to finish the work of Hitler. And this is what Oxford University is taking their money from. It's the same at Yale. It's the same at Georgetown. It's the same at Columbia University. It's the same at the Sorbonne. And people like Tariq Ramadan, who are funded by Muslim Brotherhood sources out of Qatar and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and the like, is affecting the education that we receive in the very institutions that are at the cornerstone of defending and protecting and nurturing our democratic principles. And these are things that we as students and scholars and faculty members and administrators need to take very seriously. Can you imagine, I was a part of the anti-apartheid movement. Could you imagine at the height of apartheid in the 1980s, when the anti-apartheid movement was in full swing, could you imagine the P5+1 giving $150 billion to the white apartheid regime in Pretoria? Could you imagine? Could you imagine giving money to the white South African apartheid regime and appointing these kind of characters, these white supremacist, Nazi ideologically espousing characters as the head of the most important research centers of the most important universities in the Western world? And yet, this is what's happening today in North America and throughout Western Europe. And I'll end with my story. So coming from the human rights community, which is very much a part of my upbringing in Montreal, I was saying earlier some of the things I did. I remember starting with Carol Zimmerman, a group called Quebec pour tout. I was 15 or 16 years old. Minorities were worried about their place in Quebec in the 70s. And this is where my activism began. So to make a long story short, I went to the Durban II conference in Geneva. Durban I was where the NGO community started to use this type of rhetoric influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. There's sort of this red-green alliance that we call. The red and the green, the Saieds and the Foucaults want to end Western hegemony. So people who think they're on the left, people who think they're liberal, people who think they're doing women a service in Gaza, Nigeria, and Tehran, and Baghdad, want to end Western and or American hegemony. So they team up with these characters from the Muslim Brotherhood and other anti-Western hegemonic forces, and they think they're progressive. We call it the Red-Green Alliance. So in Durban 1 in 2001, this is where this canard of the attack on the anti-Semitism moved from Christian to racist to the attack on Jewish peoplehood. And in 2001 in Durban, the United Nations Conference to End Racism, this is where the canard, the dominant force of anti-Semitism, really took off. And Jewish people who attended the conference were physically attacked, and Israel was demonized in the most extraordinary way. Durban 2 was in Geneva. It happened on Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah, which is a whole issue in itself, but the United Nations is born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. It's born out of the ashes of the Second World War. And the world got together to say never again. Professor Kotler, who I now see, was in Geneva, playing a key role there. I was on he was on many panels. I was on one panel with him, and we had there was a panel on genocide, and there was a conference on the history of genocide. There were people from Sudan that were experiencing genocide, and Professor Kotler and myself spoke about incitement to genocide. And on Yom HaShoah, Ahmadinejad, the head of Iran, was there espousing his hatred, amazingly, at the UN, the very institution that was born out of this notion that we'll never do this again. So after the session, a group of people from Rwanda came up to me. And I never really met people from Rwanda, and there was a group of people from the Rwandan mission. And they said, "We are taking you for coffee, come with us." And about 15 people from Rwanda took me for coffee at the UN Cafe. And I didn't even know what they wanted from me. I went for the coffee. They were very nice. And they were saying, this is 6, 7 years ago, they were saying to me, "Don't you understand? Don't the Jewish people understand? Don't you understand that Iran is doing exactly what Hitler did to you? Iran is doing exactly what happened to us in Rwanda. When we were called horrific names, and by calling people horrific names and saying horrible things about people, they're allowing you, the Jews, to be dehumanized to such an extent that something horrible is going to happen." And they were telling me to go back to America, to go back to Europe and warn the Jewish community that this is horrible. And they were right. Things are not exactly perhaps as we predicted 7 or 8 years ago, but we can see that they were right, that the forces that were espousing and espoused this horrific form of Nazi anti-Semitism are now in Syria butchering their fellow Muslims to further their goal. And this is the tragedy. And out of this meeting and out of this friendship that started then, I was invited to go to Rwanda, and I participated in a very special event in the Rwandan parliament commemorating the 20th anniversary of the genocide. And, you know, in my imagination, survivors are old people. I grew up with a lot of survivors. Montreal had many survivors, Jewish survivors from the Holocaust. So in my young imagination, all these people were old. You know, they were 40, 50, 30 plus years older than me growing up. So they were around, but they were old. In Rwanda, I met people who were younger than me who survived. And that was, I don't know, a psychological, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. Something that was very disturbing. And I met people who survived the most horrific things. I met one woman who's a psychiatrist now, happily married, has children, and her sister saved her. And her sister literally threw herself on her back, and she was being macheted to death, and she was whispering to her sister that you have to live the life for me and to be happy, as she was being killed. And this psychiatrist still has regular sensations of the blood of her sister, the warm blood of her sister on her back. This is something that she lives with. Interestingly enough, I had here on Barrett Street in Côte-de-Neige, Snowdon, an aunt. Her name was Zelda. And Zelda survived the Holocaust. And she came to Canada and met Fred. He also survived. They lost everything in Europe. And they got married here, and their families were, nobody else survived. And when I was a child, when I was about 8 years old, Zelda jumped from her balcony in her apartment on Barrett because she couldn't handle the dreams that she was having. A lot of survivors still survive every day. And when you're a kid, 8 years old, I knew Aunt Zelda died. I know she went through the Holocaust. And it was a part of my memory and part of my family's memory. And Aunt Zelda and Fred used to call me Prince Charles. I was like their favorite nephew, and they used to bring me gifts. I had all these very warm memories of them. And when I was in Rwanda, I don't know if it's like a post-traumatic moment, but it sort of clicked what happened to Zelda. So here I was in the midst of all these survivors in Rwanda, and I really had like an awakening or an experience to Zelda, and understanding as an adult what happened to my aunt, no longer through the prism of an 8-year-old child in Chamonix, but through a man dealing with these issues. And it was a startling experience. So what to say? I think to sum up, as Professor Wiesel said, and I mentioned this many times in the lecture, anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it doesn't end with Jews. And as Prime Minister Trudeau said in the opening remark, and I agree profoundly what I said, to say never again has to be a call for action. It must be a call for action. And to acquiesce, to allow research centers to be headed by Sheikh Kawadari at Oxford University, somebody who openly and consistent to his ideology, to the core of his ideology, calls for believers to finish the work of Hitler. That we accept money and give people like that honors in Western universities, in the finest institutions of the West, the very institutions that prepare the future leaders and decision makers of our democracy. And if we allow the interests like Boeing and Siemens to do major contracts with characters like this and social movements like Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood, what are we doing for our future? What are we doing for the future of human rights? So while everybody's looking at the Likud, Zionist, apartheid, fascist regime, which is treating survivors from Syria as we speak, by the way, because it's happening just a few kilometers from the borders, well, we've put our focus here and paid no attention to the plight of Syrians, of Iraqis, of the fragility of countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And we see the shaking of the region affecting nationalism and xenophobia and even the cohesion of European society. When are we going to say enough is enough? When are we going to pursue the justice and defend the liberal, social democratic human rights that we purport to believe in? And these are very challenging questions and very challenging issues. I know you will cover this in your program in the next 2 days, but these are crucial problems and issues for our time, and for young people, for students, and for scholars, and for faculty. These are issues that we really need to address and really begin to think out of the box and to debate and discuss and study taboos. It's time to end the taboo. We have to study contemporary anti-Semitism in the university. We have to look at reactionary elements of all societies. We have to fight sexism where it exists and homophobia where it exists. And not just North American women are entitled to certain rights while other women we can't touch because it's a cultural situation or issue. These are great challenges that affect our paradigms, our frameworks, and how we perceive reality, but these issues are coming closer to home, and we really need to address them. So thank you for listening, and thank you for the honor of me being here.
There's going to be a question and answer period. Did anybody have any questions?
Thank you for your very insightful talk. I always thought that Edward Said's book about Orientalism, sort of his critique of Orientalizing influences in the history of England and of colonial powers. I think they're mostly British and French historians in the book. I read it a while ago. That critique of historians who don't see the other in the face is actually somewhat similar to the beginning comments that you mentioned of Emmanuel Levinas based on Pirkei Avot. So I thought that was extremely interesting. I thought that maybe you could speak a bit more on the presence of Islamic studies at Oxford universities, and to what extent, because I really don't know much about this, to what extent they were linked to or dealing from the history of the Oriental Studies department that many people studied at, that Abba Ibn studied at. So there was a strong tradition of Oriental studies, and when do these break into Islamic studies or the studies of the Middle East? And which college is that professor at?
Thanks. Should I collect them or just answer? Just answer? Or, okay. So thank you. Nice to see you. Good question. So I think that, you know, there's an interesting, I think there's a break that occurs from, there was a famous debate with Edward Said and Bernard Lewis, and I think that's when the guard sort of changed. And I think you have to remember, and I didn't mention it, but Said and Michel Foucault were spending a lot of time in Paris in the 70s, in the late 70s. And they were arguing that the Iranian Revolution that was sort of bubbling was going to be akin to what the French Revolution was to Enlightenment. The Iranian Revolution was going to be to Islam. So they were putting stock, and this is, I think, a great example of sort of the left-green alliance, where you have people who are claiming to be critical scholars, promoting sort of a progressive human rights agenda, and they're supporting one of the most pernicious reactionary social movements in the world. And I think, in a sense, that in this postmodern, Orientalism that we're being affected by intellectually, that we're sort of living in this intellectual quicksand, where we're almost ideologically and intellectually handcuffed to do anything. And I think in the last 8 years, 10 years, 20 years, certainly during the last administration, the inability to articulate the problem, because to articulate the problem meant you were a fascist, Islamophobic, racist, is extraordinarily problematic. You have the killing in the nightclub in Orlando, Florida, where 49 American citizens were murdered because they were gay. And you can't have an honest conversation at the moment, or at the time of the massacre. You could not have a serious conversation about what just happened. That was a horrific hate crime that was informed, influenced, directed by an ideology that is opposed to democratic principles, because in democracy, people have the right to be equal under one legal system. But we couldn't have this conversation. And I think that fact that we can't have the conversation comes out of our miseducation. So yes, to study the excesses of nationalism after the Second World War, to study racism, to study colonialism, to study the impact of racism and colonialism in the world, in our societies, is of great importance. And I think the fact that we in the Academy have done that for the last 4 or 5 decades, studied racism, studied colonialism, studied sexual inequality, gendered inequality, The fact that we have done comprehensive research, the fact that we check our language, that we understand that words have power, and to use words that are sexist or homophobic or racist, if you're educated, you don't do that anymore. The lexicon has shifted, and rightfully so. But that type of deep analysis has not occurred in the study of anti-Semitism. The study of anti-Semitism is quarantined, in my view, to a Jewish clientele. So Jewish students and some German students will study the Holocaust and the history of anti-Semitism, as important and vital as it is. But it's off in the ghetto of the university. And we have not studied, and we will not study, we don't study, contemporary anti-Semitism. And you speak about Oxford. The first year we've been doing the summer program in Oxford. We bring professors from all over the world. We sign an agreement with their home university. The president or the dean of their university signs a contract saying that the course that they develop in our program will be taught for credits in their home university within a year. And now we've done 2 pilot years. We have 56 graduates from 22 countries. About 90% so far teaching their course for credit. So it's a start. But when we showed up at Oxford with our program, the Oriental Studies Department and Islamic Studies Department put tremendous pressure on the college that was going to host us because a Zionist fascist propaganda summer institute was coming to Oxford. Imagine, we had some of the best scholars from North America, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, coming to teach professors. We had some of the most some of the greatest leading scholars in the field of religion, sociology, economics, history, Middle East studies, African studies, and they were tarnished with this brush. Some were Jewish, some were Muslim, some were from all over the world. And if it wasn't for a colleague, a very liberal, Guardian reading intellectual at Hartford College who told the head of the college that if this program is canceled, that she was going to quit and go to the media. And her name is Josephine Reinel. She's not Jewish, but she's a quintessential liberal. She doesn't agree with all of the politics. She sat in on the classes. She didn't like some of the seminars. She disagreed with some of the content of our program. But she believes in freedom of expression and academic freedom. And she sat in on the course and she loved it. It was an amazing, intensive program. So if it wasn't for her, the program would have been canceled. Today, in our third year, in the last few months, 6 colleges are inviting us to attend. Word has got out that we're a serious academic program, and more colleges want to work with us. So if it wasn't for Josephine Reinel, professor of anthropology, we wouldn't have been able to do the program. And as a footnote, there are many American Ivy League universities, 3 in particular, that wouldn't allow us to do the course because we were tarred with the same brush. And so academic freedom, dealing with these issues at a high caliber, academic level is so important to engage students, to create a space in the university that's legitimate. So there's many organizations are fighting anti-Semitism on campus, and we're trying to create a space around the world where faculty and students can legitimately study at a high caliber, discuss, debate, and even argue about these issues. And faculty can legitimately teach the classes, and students can legitimately take them. So not fighting on issues of anti-Semitism on the campus or in the cafeteria, but fighting them on the battlefield of ideas are very important. And I'll just say one quick point. Barry Kosman wrote a very important study about 18 months ago looking at anti-Semitism in the United States and the UK. And I don't remember the exact statistics, but he looked at, in the United States, I think it was about 21% of African-American students have experienced or witnessed a racist incident within 6 months. About 28% of women witnessed or experienced a sexist event in 6 months on campus. 81% of Jewish American students have witnessed or experienced anti-Semitism. And with my study with Ed Kaplan, I won't go into all the details, but we showed the correlation very powerfully between classical forms of anti-Semitism and demonizing or bashing Israel. So those who bash Israel may not be anti-Semitic. It's certainly you can criticize many societies without being hateful. But those who bash Israel are 13 times more likely than the average population in 10 European countries to be classically anti-Semitic as well. So there's a strong correlation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Small, for your